Hello, Regan. It's very good to talk to you. I have been trying to publicize more just recently, so our schedules kind of line up, and that's great. I started making films in the neighborhood here in Los Angeles when I was about 10. I had found my family's old hand wound 8 millimeter camera and decided to buy some movie film. And 3 or 4 years after that, I was in high school, and I'd already been pursuing an interest in makeup and cosmetic effects, special effects, um, partially through just having an interest in Halloween also. And at a science fiction convention, I met Richard Silverthorne, who taught me how to use foam latex, rubber, and make molds, and generally be proficient with the basics of prosthetic appliance makeups. And this knowledge was applied to building some monsters and masks for the March of Dimes haunted house in 1984 while I was still in high school. And this was in West Covina, a huge haunted house this was. And it ran for the month of October. Now, that alone, that one haunted house was something that had a crew of 50 or 60 people running the many rooms because it was built inside the ruins of an elementary school in West Covina that looked like it had been there since maybe the 1940s. Now, the March of Dimes people needed volunteers to supervise and build and dress these horror rooms, and many people in the area stepped forward to get involved. I was there to make some rubber masks and provide some prosthetic makeups. And it was almost a shame to see the building getting used like this because it needed to be semi-destroyed in order to be turned into a Halloween house of horrors, you know. The buildings were beautiful, and the library was actually still there and still had books in it. They were very old books that were falling apart, like in the Twilight Zone. I'm sorry, the the Time Machine movie. Yes, we have books. That scene. They had a whole library of books that were basically turning into dust and wood if you tried to read them. And the school was scheduled to be demolished and replaced with a shopping center, which it was the next year in 1985. So at the site there now, there's a shopping center with a sandwich shop, and, several restaurants. Anyway, this was a perfect thing. The transformation of a fairly large public school building, which was comprised of many buildings and had separate offices and a cafeteria with a huge kitchen and a baseball field and playground. It was actually a fairly large area. And the whole thing was transformed into a 44-room circus of horrors that took nearly an hour to get through. And I think the admission price was $3 or $3.50. And I hope it made tremendous money. To all indications, it did, because every night I was there, there were lots of people in line. It seemed very popular. Now, the first two real movies I worked on, The Osterman Weekend and Lady in White, Frank LaLoggia's second feature, those were done assisting Richard Silverthorne in his workshop. And from there, I started looking for jobs around Hollywood, reading the trade papers and looking for projects I could use my skills on. And in 1986, I got my first fairly big project, which was called Dark Romances. And then shortly after that, I was very lucky to meet and work with director Andy Milligan on two of his films. Now, Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare, that was 1991. I think when we were making it, and it was released in 92, I think. And that was a great deal of fun. And there was a lot of time on set with that one and in the studio building at the shop. That was done for John Buechler, who treated me very well on the project, and I didn't know I was one of the supervisors until the movie was done and I saw my name in the credits. That was very nice of them to give me a supervisory credit. There were several supervisors that I was working with and under. And I guess they needed a lot of prosthetic effects, not just rubber appliances for the typical blood and gore, but also kind of mechanical appliances that could do little, I don't know, like surrealistic Freddy effects. The bed of spikes, for example. That's one of the effects that was like a mechanical prosthetic that created these holes that appeared in the character's chest as he's lying there on the ground. And a couple of times I applied some gory wounds to Robert Englund when we did reshoots for the ending fight scene. Now, the two main supervisors at John Buechler's studio were Chris Robbins and Nick Mara, and they were in charge of everything overall, and they created many puppets and dummies, including the Freddy dummy that you see blow up at the end of the film. And I also want to mention John Buechler's production manager, John Foster, who was very good to work with and a very good person as well. Now, Scanner Cop 2, or Scanners the Showdown, that was done for John Buechler also, and at that point I had demonstrated some dexterity with creating bladder effects or inflatable effects, which I had been doing since the 1980s, but I'd certainly gotten more proficient at it and gotten some of the methods down better. So there were several artists creating the main effects, including Chris Robbins and Nick Mara and James Rowland, and I was to be on hand as a kind of a bladder supervisor to supervise how all the bladder effects were being built and make sure they were all working and so on, making sure everything inflated correctly and fit together correctly. So some responsibility came along with that. And we did many types of bladders, invented a couple of weird variations that I think hadn't been tried, and as sometimes happens on the best of shows, occasionally there was an effect that didn't work or move as well as expected, and I had one of those. And this was a mechanical makeup, the face of a security guard that was split open, and it didn't move the way we wanted it to once we got it in front of the camera. That was unfortunate. But the upside was it looked really good in still photographs. So the still photographer got some wonderful photos of this thing. It was nicely lit. And it wound up on the cover of Fangoria. And I was very flattered by that. So that turned out to be, I don't know, I guess a good thing. The Lawnmower Man. I did a stop motion effect for that one for a scene of blisters growing on Job's hand, and also some miscellaneous makeup effects. And there was a crumbling mummy skull at the end of the film that we see briefly, and that was fun to do also. That was made of plaster, bandages, and fuller's earth cast inside a silicone mold, and kind of like a thin eggshell. And it was rigged up on the inside with nylon pull wires so that we could make it implode. And so that was a matter of building something that was designed to fall apart, but in a controlled way. Now, sadly, a digital effect was superimposed over this, kind of obscuring it, so you can't see the head collapsing very well. But it did work. I think we made 3 collapsing mummy heads for 3 takes. Okay, Entity Files and California's Most Haunted. Now, this was around 2002, California's Most Haunted was produced by Barry Conrad, and this was a show that was broadcast on the Sci-Fi Channel and did very well in the ratings. Now for that, I did an animated sequence showing orbs of green light flying around the room and then coalescing into the shape of a muscular man that was made out of green light. Now, several different techniques were combined for this scene. There was a stop-motion puppet and also some live puppeteering, and there was also morphing and digital painting and a little bit of wireframe CG animation. And two associates of mine, Sam Oldham and Wayne Reese, did the compositing, and it worked out very well, and I'm still happy with it. The footage was so good, actually, it caused some people to have nightmares after it was shown at paranormal ghost hunter conventions. And then when Anchor Bay released a DVD of The Entity in 2005, they created a short documentary about the actual Doris Byther case. The film showed several photographs taken during the investigation, and then they cut to the reconstruction footage we did for California's Most Haunted. And I had tried to make this as close as possible to the witnesses' reports, and we had a couple of those witnesses on hand, so I could ask specific questions about what this thing looked like, what they saw. Now, when I heard that more than one person had had nightmares after watching the footage, I did feel very good, because we took the effort to do it very seriously and not as a joke or a cheap throwaway effect. We tried to make it seem as real as possible. Dark Romances 1 and 2, Volume 1 and 2. This we started in 1986, and filming went through 1987, usually on a weekend. It was one of those. And it had a budget that was very small, and the producers were trying to squeeze a lot of look out of the money, and they did a pretty good job of that. And it was a great working with actress Brink Stevens the first time. They included many gruesome effects in Dark Romances, so I kept coming back again and again to do more gory latex rubber effects or puppets and things. And we got some nice press coverage out of that in Variety. And then it was distributed on very small VHS labels for a while. So out of everything, it's really been the least available and least seen of the projects I've worked on. But there is a new Blu-ray release being prepared right now, 35 years after the fact. It's coming out again in digital format. Zombie Party from 1987. Now that was a featurette about 50 minutes long and very episodic. We had barely enough material for it to be that long, so it was mostly made out of vignettes, zombie jokes. And this was produced with pocket money while Dark Romances was still being photographed. A couple of times we filmed at Easy TV Studios in West Hollywood, so you see that same building where so many scenes from Dark Romances were filmed. And we also filmed in different places in Los Angeles and Venice Beach, California. And it was meant to be a throwaway comedy, and we picked zombies as a topic because they were easy to do. And you might like to see the material from Zombie Party that's currently up right now on YouTube, including the more recent trailer promo. Yeah, these things are actually the best representation of Zombie Party right now, because its original incarnation was a flat VHS tape in a generic sleeve with mono audio. And in more recent years, Sam Oldham and I went back and recut some material and even added effects with digital tools that didn't exist at that time. So this is kind of revisionist thinking, but in this case I think it makes sense to dress Zombie Party up with stereo sound and new digital effects and so on. Secrets and Mysteries TV show, also known, I think it's also known as Ancient Mysteries, and this was done for ABC TV in 1987. They needed some makeup and puppet effects. I did a smooth-headed everyman character for the opening sequence, and then they did an episode that needed an alien creature that steps out of a spaceship, and I created that also. At that point, I was living at home, and I was building everything in the garage and occasionally using the oven to bake the foam rubber. Now, the alien creature was done both as a rubber mask and as a mechanical puppet head. Now, the puppet head was for close-ups, and the mask was worn by a small actor for wide shots. And Scott Tanaka built the whole thing with me, and he painted it also, a nice pale but translucent fleshy color that really helped it, I don't know, look weird. And I was trying to emulate Carlo Rambaldi on this project because the producer wanted the creature to smile and have some facial expression, some movement. And the budget was small, but there was in fact enough money to make a fiberglass underskull with some mechanics inside it, which were pulled with bicycle cables. It was a very primitive thing inside, held together with 3 or 4 different types of glue. I still remember how primitive it was. But we were able to get it to smile and move its eyelids a little for the camera. And I saw on the internet a couple of years ago, somebody commented on it and thought it had looked cool. So it seems to have worked okay. Who is my favorite horror writer? I don't actually read a lot of horror, but maybe John Bellairs. His mystery books have a very subtle quality to them, but they can get very intense. The Face in the Frost is a good recommended title. But I really like the style and atmosphere of his stories. I think they're very entertaining reading. They frequently are horrific, but again, in a subtle and metered way. For a while, back in the 1990s, I would find a John Bellairs paperback book every week and read it. It became kind of a habit for a while. I should do more reading. Now, my favorite B movie or B horror film, that probably is William Castle's 13 Ghosts from 1960. I've seen that easily more than 100 times. I think of it as a perfect feel-good light horror film that is suitable for family viewing. It's spooky, but not too much. It kind of strikes that perfect balance, and it has that William Castle gimmick of the red and blue lenses of the ghost viewer. That gives the movie an almost toy-like aspect. It's nice if you're able to find a DVD copy that has the ghost viewer in it. That sort of completes the experience. But to me, one of the great achievements to be made in movies is the horror film that is scary but consistently fun to watch. And overall, it's a positive and upbeat experience, and 13 Ghosts does that. Whenever a film comes close to delivering that kind of experience, I applaud it, because that's fun. The original 13 Ghosts succeeds in being consistently light and funny while telling a scary story. It celebrates a sense of the mysterious. It leaves many unanswered questions, but it's not leaving the viewer stranded because the whole intent of it is to entertain. So there's a line of logic that the story holds on to throughout, and beyond that, there are many ambiguities that are there just for the sake of fun. Favorite horror film? That might be Phantasm, because it steps so totally outside the boundaries of convention. In the 1970s, there was nothing that could equal that in terms of purely intimidating ambience. It's non-linear, it's weird, aggressively weird. It generates a bizarre, otherworldly atmosphere, especially at that time. It was very unique and powerful, the way the movie just felt. The music score just amplifies and reinforces this. And there were not a lot of horror films like Phantasm until Phantasm came out and started this modern trend of surrealist horrors. Favorite Canadian horror film? I absolutely loved Scanners from David Cronenberg. I was really lucky to see that in the theaters on a double bill with John Carpenter's The Fog, another great low-budget masterpiece. And totally apples and oranges, too. Two totally different types of horror and different productions with different styles of special effects. So that was a heck of a day at the theater. What's my favorite thing about Halloween and my favorite Halloween memory? Well, Halloween is something that my mom and dad initially got me into. I know this because I've seen photos of myself in early Halloween costumes at an age far too young for me to even be aware of what I was wearing. And I have very early memories of being taken around the neighborhood trick-or-treating, and those are very sweet memories indeed. The atmosphere of the area at night was magnetic, and I remember seeing some houses dressed up, and I remember people playing the Halloween sound effects records out of the front door. And that would have been around 1969 or 1970, I think. And one of the houses had their entire front porch area, I remember, decorated with many pumpkins, all carved into jack-o'-lanterns. I remember seeing 50 or 20 of these things, but there might only have been 5 or 6. Regardless of how many jack-o'-lanterns there were, the amount of effort that went into that was obvious. And the porch had all the lights out, so the only light was coming from these pumpkins. It was really beautiful. I was almost disappointed to get the candy because I wanted to stay and admire the display. And getting the candy meant that I had to go. You see what I'm saying? In that form, in the Halloween that I grew up with, that holiday was a family thing, and the pleasures of it seemed totally innocent and safe. I still feel that way about the holiday, although it's continued to change over the years, and it's something different now. Of course, what individual people do is different from what the whole neighborhood does, but I like the idea that people have a holiday like Halloween that they can use to express themselves, to express parts of their personality that they don't usually have a chance to exercise. I do like to tell ghost stories. I've put some online with the Anything Ghost podcast that Lex Wall has been doing for like 13 or 14 years now. And Brink Stevens has come in to do some voice work on those recordings also. Now, the Anything Ghost Show is one of the best and longest running shows of its type. It focuses on true stories that are often told by the person who experienced the events, and there is a serious attitude and an emphasis on quality that I think really shows. Now, I found for my own personal purposes, I enjoy listening to ghost stories when I am going to sleep because they can be so relaxing, which seems paradoxical, seems counterintuitive, but there's something about a nice voice reading a story that reminds me of being very small and being read bedtime stories. And there isn't anything that I know of that has the same effect, especially if it's a pleasant voice. I have mentioned before that I like ghost stories that are not too frightening and not too gruesome. My tastes have changed a bit since I was a teenager. I used to be all about renting the most extreme and outrageous movies from the video store, and nowadays I tend to go for more relaxed fare, quieter and subtler films, maybe. Definitely I've been watching more older films, and not many recent films. Anyway, do direct listeners to my Patreon page and to roddmatsui.com and to my Facebook page. It's been very charming talking with you, Regan. Thank you very much for having me on your show.